Eleanor had always held a deep and abiding belief in the unbreakable bonds of family, a sentiment that seemed as natural as the changing of the seasons back in her hometown of Willow Creek. For 58 years, her world had revolved around her dear husband, Arthur, and their only daughter, Bethany. Every Sunday roast, every Christmas gathering meticulously planned, every penny carefully saved. It was all for them, the two pillars of her life. When Arthur succumbed to illness last year, a part of Eleanor felt as though the very foundations of her world had crumbled. The silence in their cozy little Cape Codder just outside of Boston was deafening, each familiar corner now echoing with his absence. Yet, amidst the raw grief, Eleanor clung to the hope that she still had Bethany, her bright spark, her legacy. The house they had built together, brick by painstaking brick, in the quiet suburb of Westview held too many ghosts. Every creak of the floorboards, every ray of morning sun slanting through the kitchen window brought back a vivid memory of Arthur's gentle laughter or the comforting clink of his coffee mug. It became unbearable, a constant ache in her chest. So, with a heavy heart, Eleanor made the difficult decision to sell their beloved home. Bethany, bless her heart, along with her husband, Craig, offered Eleanor a place to stay for a while. At least, Bethany did. Craig, a man perpetually glued to his mobile phone, barely grunted a greeting when Eleanor arrived at their modern townhouse in the bustling city of Cambridge. Eleanor, ever mindful of not wanting to impose, settled quietly into the small spare room at the back. She tried her best to be helpful, always offering to cook a comforting meal, run errands to the local grocer, or tidy up around the house. Her intention was simple: to be useful, to stay out of their way, to not become a burden. But Craig had a way of making Eleanor feel like an unwelcome guest, a persistent irritation. His eyes, when they occasionally flickered her way, held a barely concealed impatience, as if she were a bothersome fly he couldn't swat away. It started with the little things, almost insignificant on their own, but collectively they chipped away at Eleanor's already fragile sense of self-worth. He'd roll his eyes heavenward if she dared to ask a simple question about the television remote or the local news. He'd abruptly change the channel when she was engrossed in her favorite gardening program, offering no apology, no explanation. Once, as he brushed past her in the hallway, Eleanor distinctly heard him mutter under his breath, the word freeloader hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. She tried to convince herself that her grief-addled mind had played a trick on her, that she had misheard his callous remark. But deep down, in the quiet corners of her heart, Eleanor knew she hadn't. The sting of his words was sharp and undeniable. And Bethany, her own daughter, the child she had nurtured and cherished? She said nothing. Eleanor would look to her, her eyes pleading for a word of support, a flicker of understanding, any sign that her daughter still saw her as her mother, not just an unwanted guest. But Bethany would always downplay Craig's behavior, offering weak excuses. "He's just stressed, Mum," she'd say, her gaze often avoiding Eleanor's. "Work's been really rough lately." Eleanor, a mother to her core, swallowed the rising shame and stayed silent. That's what mothers do, isn't it? They absorb the pain, they smooth over the cracks, they protect their children, even when that protection isn't reciprocated. But there came a night, a seemingly ordinary evening, that shattered Eleanor's quiet endurance. They were gathered around the sleek, modern dining table. Eleanor, wanting to contribute, had prepared Craig's favorite dish, a hearty shepherd's pie, the aroma filling the air with a comforting familiarity that seemed lost on everyone else. Bethany was engrossed in her phone, her thumbs flying across the screen, while Craig nursed a bottle of his usual pale ale, the silence in the room thick with unspoken tension. Then, out of the blue, Craig looked up, his gaze settling on Eleanor with an unsettling directness. "You know," he began, his voice laced with a cold indifference, "maybe it's time we stopped pretending this is some temporary arrangement. We're not running a charity here." Bethany froze, her phone clattering onto the table. Eleanor stared at him, her heart beginning to pound a heavy, ominous rhythm against her ribs. What do you mean, Craig?" She managed to stammer, her voice barely a whisper. He offered a thin, unpleasant smirk. "I mean, how long is this supposed to go on, Eleanor? You're not working, you're not contributing a dime. We've got bills to pay, responsibilities. We didn't sign up to feed extra mouths. Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat, a sharp, painful gasp. Her heart hammered against her chest, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She turned to Bethany, her eyes desperate, pleading for her daughter to say something, anything, to refute Craig's cruel words. Bethany wouldn't meet her gaze. Her eyes darted around the room, anywhere but at her mother's anguished face. Maybe Craig's right, Mom, she mumbled, her voice barely audible. Maybe it's best if you find something more stable. For everyone's sake. Everyone's sake. The words echoed in Eleanor's mind, a cruel and hollow pronouncement. In that moment, the years of unconditional love, the sacrifices she had made, the unwavering support she had always offered, felt like they had amounted to nothing. Eleanor didn't scream. She didn't argue. A strange, chilling calm settled over her. She simply stood up, her legs feeling strangely detached. She walked slowly to the small back room that had become her temporary sanctuary and began to pack her belongings. 2 suitcases. That was all that remained of her life, all that she felt she could carry. She didn't even cry as she folded her clothes, her movements mechanical, her emotions numb. The tears would come later. It was when she stood outside their modern townhouse, the late autumn wind biting through her thin coat, that the reality of her situation crashed down upon her with brutal force. She had nowhere to go. Bethany hadn't walked her out. Craig hadn't even bothered to pretend to care. Eleanor sat down on the cold curb, the rough concrete scraping against her skin. Her mobile phone battery was dead, mirroring the deadness she felt in her heart. This, she remembered thinking, the thought as cold and sharp as the wind, this is what it feels like to be erased. That night, Eleanor checked into a budget motel on the outskirts of the city, the kind where the wallpaper peeled at the seams and the vending machine seemed to have a permanent appetite for loose change. She lay awake, staring at the stained ceiling, the hum of traffic a dull, relentless drone outside her window. How had everything turned so cold? What had she done to deserve this profound and utter abandonment? The next morning, with a trembling hand, Eleanor sent Bethany a simple text message. I understand. I love you always. There was no reply. The following week, she sent another, a brief update about finding a temporary room. Then another, a quiet note on Bethany's birthday. Silence. A vast, echoing silence that stretched between them like an unbridgeable chasm. 3 months crawled by, each day feeling longer and heavier than the last. Eleanor diligently applied for job after job, anything to regain some semblance of independence, some sense of purpose. But no one seemed willing to hire a grieving widow in her late 50s with a significant gap in her recent work history. She considered cleaning houses, offering to babysit, but her body didn't move with the same youthful energy it once had. The loneliness was suffocating, a constant weight pressing down on her. And worse than the loneliness was the shame. She had poured her entire life into that girl, into her family. How could Bethany turn her back so easily? One bleak evening, as Eleanor was listlessly sifting through a small box of old family keepsakes, desperately trying to feel a connection to something, anything from her past, her fingers brushed against a familiar texture. It was her mother's old diary, a small leather-bound book she hadn't seen in years, perhaps hadn't ever truly read. But something, an inexplicable pull, drew her to it. She sat on the edge of the worn motel bed, the dim light from the bedside lamp casting long shadows on the peeling wallpaper. She carefully turned the brittle pages, and that's when she found it. A name. A truth. A secret that had been buried for decades, waiting to be unearthed. Eleanor remembered the moment with startling clarity. Her hands began to tremble, her heart leaped in her chest, a sudden, unexpected surge of something she couldn't quite name. Because in that instant, she wasn't just the mother who had been kicked out into the cold. She was someone else entirely. And for the first time in months, a small, hesitant smile touched her lips. They had taken everything from her, it seemed. But they had absolutely no idea what was coming next. The days that followed blurred into a muted tapestry of gray, the stale air of the motel room thick with the faint scent of distant cigarettes. The incessant hum of the vending machine outside her door became a melancholic lullaby of defeat. Eleanor remained quiet, the raw edges of her grief slowly beginning to dull, though the ache remained a constant companion. The tears still came some nights, but they were silent tears, the kind that racked your body with quiet tremors, held in because there was no one to offer comfort. On the fourth day, Eleanor sent Bethany another simple message: "I'm okay. Just wanted to know how you are." Still no reply. 2 weeks later, a solitary heart emoji. Nothing more. Eleanor tried to tell herself that Bethany was busy, that she would come around, that Craig must be twisting things, poisoning her daughter's mind against her. But as the weeks stretched into months, that fragile hope began to wither and rot inside her. Her meager savings were dwindling rapidly. Eleanor tried desperately to find part-time work at local grocery stores, behind the reception desks of small businesses, even at a greasy spoon diner down by the highway. But she was either deemed overqualified or not the right fit, polite code, she knew, for too old and too tired. One particularly desolate night, Eleanor sat on the floor of the cramped motel room, sorting through the only box she had brought with her that wasn't filled with clothes. It was a dusty memory box from the house, containing a jumble of old photographs, a few faded letters, and tucked right at the very bottom, the small leather-bound book, her mother's diary. It surprised her. She had no recollection of packing it. She almost placed it back in the box, but something about the smooth, worn feel of the leather in her hands made her pause. She switched on the old lamp on the side table, its warm glow illuminating the small room, and carefully opened the first page. Her mother's handwriting was instantly familiar, the same looped, neat script from the little notes she used to slip into Eleanor's lunchbox as a child, always written in blue ink. At first, the entries were mundane. Observations about the weather, complaints about the sermon at church, the rising cost of groceries. But then, Eleanor reached an entry dated June 14, 1965. "He came again today," her mother had written, the ink slightly faded with time. "He said he wished things were different, that he wished I could be his wife. But he has a family, a business, a name to protect. Eleanor will never know. She must never know. I just pray that one day she understands how much I loved her, even though she was born out of mistake and desire." Eleanor read the entry twice, then again, the words sinking into her consciousness with the force of a physical blow. She must never know. Eleanor's breath caught in her chest. She flipped further, page after fragile page, uncovering a hidden narrative of clandestine meetings at out-of-town hotels, small cash payments her mother had tried to refuse but desperately needed. Her mother never named him in full, only using the initials HJS. Then, another entry, dated February 2, 1970. He said he'd made arrangements. That if anything ever happened to him, he'd ensure Eleanor had something, a part of what he built. "It won't be official, of course. It's too dangerous. But he promised me a trust, a letter. He said his lawyer, a Mr. Goldstein, would know." The name hit Eleanor like a punch to the stomach. Goldstein. She had seen that name before, briefly, on some old legal documents her mother had kept. It took 2 days and several painstaking online searches from the motel's shared computer, the dial-up connection agonizingly slow, but she finally found him. Leonard Goldstein, a retired estate lawyer still listed under a private firm in Dallas. Eleanor didn't call. Her hands trembled too much. Her voice felt trapped in her throat. Instead, she penned a letter, a real, handwritten letter on the cheap motel stationery. She explained who she was, who her mother had been, and asked, begged, for a conversation. 2 weeks later, the phone in her drab motel room rang. Eleanor remembered the way his voice cracked when she mentioned her mother's name. He knew her. Not just professionally, but personally. "I always wondered if you'd reach out someday, Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with a mixture of sadness and something akin to relief. "There's something you need to see." Eleanor booked a Greyhound bus ticket to Dallas for the very next morning. Her suitcase was only half packed, a sliver of cautious practicality holding on to the possibility that this could all be some elaborate scam. But when she walked into that quiet, book-lined office, the air thick with the scent of old paper and even older silence. She knew it was real. Mr. Goldstein handed her a sealed envelope, yellowed and fragile with age. It was from Harold James Sterling, the founder of Sterling Energy, one of the biggest oil firms in Central Texas, a name Eleanor had seen in newspaper clippings her entire life. A man with a prominent family, a sterling reputation, a powerful legacy. The letter was addressed to "My dearest daughter, Eleanor Margaret." Eleanor couldn't read the whole thing in one go. Tears welled in her eyes before she even reached the second paragraph. He admitted everything. The affair, the regret, the silent love he had carried for her mother. And then the promise. "In the event of my death, I have insured a portion of my personal assets, untraceable through my estate, are to be delivered to you via Mr. Goldstein. You are my blood, Eleanor. And though I was too much a coward to claim you in life, I claim you now in death." Mr. Goldstein slid a thick folder across the mahogany desk. Inside were bank account statements, a modest but significant investment portfolio, ownership papers, titles. The total value? A little over $2 million. Eleanor stared at the documents, then back at the kind-faced lawyer. This is real?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. He nodded gently. "It's yours, Eleanor. Always was." Eleanor's heart thundered in her chest, not just because of the staggering sum of money, but because for the first time in her life, she felt chosen, seen. She didn't scream or laugh or break down. She simply sat there, quiet as a whisper, letting the truth wash over her like a long-awaited rain after a parched drought. That night, back in her dingy motel room, Eleanor didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, just as she had for months, but this time a small, determined smile played on her lips. They thought they had discarded her, thought she was finished. But they had absolutely no idea. Eleanor wasn't broken. She was just getting started. The discovery of her mother's diary in that desolate motel room had been like a jolt of unexpected electricity, shaking Eleanor out of the numbing fog of grief and despair. The revelation that she was the daughter of a prominent man, a man who had secretly provided for her future, was staggering. It was as if a hidden root, long buried and forgotten, had suddenly sprouted, offering a fragile sense of belonging, a whisper of a different past. The days that followed her return from Dallas were a blur of quiet activity. The sterile anonymity of the budget motel was replaced by the slightly less sterile but equally impersonal short-term rental Eleanor found in a quiet, unassuming neighborhood a short bus ride from Cambridge. It was a far cry from the life she had known with Arthur, but it was her own space, a sanctuary where she could process the seismic shift in her understanding of her life. She spent hours poring over the documents Mr. Goldstein had given her, the legal jargon slowly yielding to comprehension. The bank accounts held a substantial sum, a figure that made Eleanor's head spin. The investment portfolio, though described as modest by the seasoned lawyer, was more wealth than Eleanor had ever imagined possessing. And then there were the ownership papers, the titles to various assets she was still trying to fully grasp. The sheer weight of this newfound wealth was overwhelming, but it wasn't the money itself that resonated most deeply within Eleanor. It was the undeniable truth that she had been acknowledged, finally seen, by a man she had never known but who was undeniably a part of her. It was a validation that cut through the years of feeling like an afterthought, a mistake. Sleep remained elusive some nights, the hum of the city a constant backdrop to her thoughts. But now, when Eleanor lay awake staring at the ceiling, it wasn't with the crushing weight of despair. A quiet determination had taken root, a sense that her story wasn't over, that perhaps, just perhaps, she had a hand in writing the next chapter. She didn't rush back to Bethany and Craig's townhouse. Something profound had shifted within her during those solitary days and nights. Eleanor wasn't just the forgotten mother anymore. She was someone new, someone who had lived a life built on a foundation of a hidden truth, and who was only now beginning to understand the full implications of that truth. The shame that had clung to her like a shroud began to dissipate, replaced by a dawning sense of clarity. Eleanor spent the next few weeks in her rented apartment, a quiet observer of the world around her. She walked through unfamiliar streets, sipped coffee in local cafes, watching people go about their lives, lives that hadn't been so abruptly appended. For the first time, she didn't feel a pang of envy, but rather a detached curiosity. Who among them carried hidden burdens? Who had faced betrayal and found a way to carry on? Leonard Goldstein's gift wasn't just the inheritance, it was also the gift of time. Time to process, time to understand the power she now held in her hands. It wasn't just financial power, it was the power to shape her own future, to no longer be at the mercy of others' whims. Grief, Eleanor was discovering, could indeed become a strange kind of fuel, especially when coupled with the sting of humiliation. When she finally returned to Cambridge, Eleanor didn't go back to the townhouse. Instead, she booked a short-term rental in a modern apartment building overlooking a bustling square, a world away from the cramped spare room she had occupied before. It was the kind of place Bethany and Craig would likely assume was beyond her means. Eleanor began to present herself differently. Her clothes, though still understated, were now more polished, more deliberate. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. It wasn't about being flashy or drawing attention, but about a new kind of invisibility, the kind that allows you to move through the world unnoticed but not powerless. She started devouring online resources, watching YouTube videos on investing, real estate contracts, the intricacies of property management. She learned the language of business, not because she harbored dreams of building an empire, but because she wanted to understand how the world worked, how to protect herself. Never again would she allow herself to be so utterly vulnerable. It was during one of her late-night online research sessions that she found it. Buried deep within a real estate auction website was a listing for a small apartment building in a gentrifying area just east of Cambridge. It was described as fixer-upper, in need of significant renovation, but structurally sound. The location, however, made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. It was the exact complex where Bethany and Craig lived. She sat there, staring at the grainy photographs of the building, her heart pounding a mixture of disbelief and a strange, nascent sense of, not quite revenge, but something akin to it. The listing indicated that the current owner was in default on property taxes, and the auction was scheduled in 2 weeks. Without hesitation, Eleanor contacted Mr. Goldstein. With his expert guidance, she established a limited liability company, an anonymous shell corporation. The paperwork was filed, the funds were transferred, and Eleanor placed her bid. She wasn't driven by a desire for outright vengeance, not exactly. But she was determined to take control of the one place where Bethany and Craig had held power over her, the place they considered their domain. The auction came and went with surprising speed and little fanfare. Eleanor, bidding through her newly formed LLC, won quietly, legally, entirely under the radar. And just like that, Eleanor owned the building where her daughter and son-in-law resided, the very place where they had so casually dismissed her, where they had offered hollow excuses and left her standing on the curb with 2 suitcases and a shattered heart. Eleanor remembered sitting at the small desk in her rented apartment, the deed to the building lying before her. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips as she whispered aloud, a quiet promise to herself. Let's see how Craig enjoys paying rent to an extra mouth he couldn't feed. A month later, the official notification letters were sent out to all tenants. Rents would be reassessed to current market value, and lease terms would be reviewed. For Bethany and Craig, the new amount was triple their previous rent, not just double, but a full 3-fold increase, plus overdue fees that Eleanor knew Craig, with his meticulous but often delayed bill-paying habits, would likely have accrued. Eleanor didn't need to witness Craig's reaction to know it would be explosive. She could almost feel the waves of his incandescent rage radiating across the city. But this wasn't solely about the money. It was about pride, about control. Craig was a man who thrived on feeling superior, on dictating terms. And Eleanor had just silently, legally, pulled the rug out from under him. 2 days after the notices went out, Bethany tried to call. It was the first time Eleanor had heard from her daughter since that devastating night. Eleanor let it go to voicemail. Mum, I don't know if you've heard, but something really weird is going on. Our rent just shot up like a lot. Craig is losing it. I don't know. Can we talk? Bethany's voice was laced with a tremor of panic, a stark contrast to her previous dismissiveness. Eleanor didn't respond. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about gravity. Bethany and Craig needed to feel the weight of their choices, the tangible consequences of their actions. Eleanor drove by the building once, late one evening. Their lights were on in their second-floor unit. She could see shadows moving behind the drawn curtains, Bethany pacing, Craig's unmistakable silhouette gesturing wildly. Eleanor watched them for a minute, a strange mix of hollowness and a quiet sense of vindication swirling within her. But beneath it all, a familiar ache persisted. Even now, knowing what she knew, holding the power she held, a part of her still yearned to be invited back in, not to the apartment, but to her daughter's heart. But she knew that wasn't possible, not yet. So, Eleanor remained silent, and she waited. Because sometimes, the loudest justice is the one that doesn't utter a single word. And Eleanor knew, deep down, that she wasn't finished yet. The true extent of the change within Eleanor didn't fully register until she saw Bethany at the local supermarket, about 3 weeks after the rent increase took effect. Bethany didn't see her. Eleanor was 2 aisles over, partially concealed behind a display of discounted breakfast cereal. Bethany looked tired. Not just physically weary, but worn down, as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, the way she used to wear it when she had been crying. Her shopping cart was half empty, filled mostly with cheap staples: rice, eggs, a few off-brand cans of soup. Eleanor should have walked away, should have avoided the painful encounter. But she didn't. A strange compulsion, a lingering maternal instinct perhaps, made her follow Bethany through the store at a discreet distance, her own heart pounding with a nervous energy, as if she were doing something forbidden. Bethany paused in front of a small stack of macaroni and cheese boxes, the kind Eleanor used to buy for her as a child. Bethany looked down at her phone, her shoulders slumping almost imperceptibly as she read a text message, likely from Craig. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of her current reality, she placed the box back on the shelf. That small, seemingly insignificant moment broke something within Eleanor. Not in a way that made her gloat, but in a way that triggered a deep, visceral ache. She remembered the little girl who used to run to her, tears streaming down her face, when she scraped her knee on the sidewalk. The child who asked her every night to check for monsters under her bed. And now, that same little girl was living with one. Eleanor drove back to her quiet apartment that day and sat on the sofa in silence for hours, staring out at the bustling square below. Life, she mused, had twisted them into strangers. But she reminded herself that this wasn't punishment, this was consequence. And consequence, she knew, was long overdue. Eleanor had plans now, not just the ownership of the building, but a quiet, slow chess match. Every move calculated, every step thoughtful. With the LLC firmly in place and the property legally transferred, she began to initiate small repairs to the building. A leaky faucet here, a broken lock there, flickering lights in the hallway. Craig never seemed to notice, too consumed by his escalating rent and his furious email exchanges with the property manager, demanding answers, threatening legal action. But Eleanor knew Craig. She understood the workings of his ego. He wouldn't move. To him, that would be an admission of defeat. And Bethany, Eleanor knew, would follow his lead, as she always had. So, Eleanor continued her quiet machinations. She changed the property signage to a simple, understated, ML Holdings. She had security cameras installed near the lobby, updated the tenants' mailboxes, all under the anonymous banner of her company, ML Holdings, a subtle nod to her own name, Margaret Louise. No one, least of all Bethany and Craig, knew who was behind it. Then came the notice for mandatory annual inspections. Craig's response, sent through the tenant portal, was a torrent of furious indignation, filled with empty threats and self-righteous pronouncements. Eleanor smiled faintly as she read it. He was unraveling, and she didn't need to lift a finger. Meanwhile, Eleanor was slowly evolving into someone she barely recognized. She wore her hair differently now, styled in sharper, more defined lines. Her clothes, though still classic, had a newfound sophistication. She walked with a purpose she hadn't possessed in years. She started attending small business meetups under a pseudonym, learning the ropes of real estate, building a network of contacts. No one asked about her past. They only saw a quiet, composed woman with keen eyes and readily available capital. Eleanor was learning that the best disguise was often the truth, simply unburdened by unnecessary details. One crisp autumn morning, as Eleanor was leaving a tenant association meeting in the building's small common room, she passed Bethany and Craig in the parking lot. She kept her sunglasses on, her hair tucked neatly into a sleek bun, a folder of documents clutched in her hand. Bethany barely glanced her way, her gaze downcast. Craig didn't recognize her at all. Later that night, Eleanor sat in her quiet apartment, sipping tea, the city lights twinkling outside her window. It felt strangely surreal to walk right past her own child and be completely invisible, not because she was weak, but because she was stronger than they remembered. They couldn't see her now because they were still clinging to the image of the woman they used to control, and that woman, Eleanor knew, was gone. The calls from Bethany continued, soft, hesitant voicemails that Eleanor rarely listened to in full. "Hi Mum. Just wanted to see if maybe you had time to talk. I know things have been complicated." Eleanor didn't return them, not out of cruelty, but because Bethany needed to feel the void she had helped create. And every time a flicker of doubt crept in, Eleanor opened her mother's diary, reading those poignant words over and over again. Eleanor will never know. She must never know. But Eleanor did know now, and with that knowledge came a quiet strength, a kind of inner armor that no one could easily penetrate. She was no longer the woman begging for a place under their roof. She was the woman who owned it. Eleanor had always believed that true resolution wasn't about getting even. It was about balance, about a quiet correction, not a raging war. But when she saw the email response from Craig after he received the notice of his dramatically increased rent, she had to admit, a small flicker of satisfaction ignited within her. Subject: rent increase. This is absolutely unacceptable. This must be a mistake. Tripling our rent. That's extortion. I demand to speak to whoever owns this dump. We've lived here for 3 years and have never been late with a single payment. This is robbery. He signed it, Craig D. Harmon, as if his name somehow lent weight to his outrage. Eleanor read the email 3 times, a wry smile playing on her lips, and then forwarded it to her property manager with a simple note. Please respond using standard clause C regarding market rate adjustments. No special exceptions. Craig wasn't just angry, he was stunned. His arrogance had never allowed for the possibility that someone could outmaneuver him so completely. He had become so accustomed to being in control that the idea of answering to a faceless landlord, someone he couldn't intimidate or belittle, drove him into a frenzy. Bethany tried calling again that same night. The voicemail this time was different, stripped of any pretense. "Mum. I know you're not picking up, but I really need to talk to you. Things are really rough right now. Craig is. He's upset. He's taking it out on everything. We're trying to figure things out. I miss you. I do." Her voice cracked at the end, a raw, vulnerable sound. For a fleeting moment, Eleanor's fingers hovered over the call back button on her phone. She could call her daughter, tell her it would be okay, that she would fix everything. But she didn't. Because it wasn't okay, and Eleanor couldn't keep fixing the messes Bethany had helped create. Bethany had stood by while Craig threw her out like she was nothing more than an unpaid bill. Now that the pressure was on Bethany, she remembered how to dial her mother's number. No, Eleanor would let her sit with the silence a little longer. The following week, Eleanor authorized additional upgrades to the property. New exterior paint, brighter hallway lighting, landscaping improvements. Craig's exorbitant rent wasn't just a symbolic act. It was directly funding improvements that benefited all the other tenants. The irony, Eleanor noted with a quiet sense of grim amusement, would likely be lost on him. He began leaving angry, handwritten notes under the door of the management office. "The water pressure is terrible. The trash is piling up. If this is what we're paying for, it's a joke." Every note went unanswered. Bethany stopped leaving voicemails and started sending short, pleading text messages. "Hey, can we talk? I really need you." Then, silence again. Meanwhile, the bank statements for ML Holdings painted a different picture. The company was stable, profitable even. The other tenants were quiet, respectful, and paid their rent on time. It was only Craig who was making noise, and Bethany, caught in the storm of his making. But things took a more serious turn when Eleanor received the quarterly report from the building manager. Attached were photographs of Bethany and Craig's unit. The bathroom showed visible mildew, kitchen tiles were cracked, and mail was piling up on the floor. They were cutting corners, living lean. Eleanor should have felt a pang of pity, but instead, she felt a cold clarity. This wasn't just about rent anymore, it was about power, and Craig was losing it, fast. Word around the building, relayed discreetly by the building manager, was that Craig had started working extra hours at his job. Another tenant had seen Bethany crying on the back steps one afternoon. They were unraveling from the inside out, and Eleanor hadn't had to utter a single word. That was the part Eleanor kept returning to in her thoughts. For so long, she had been the one begging to be heard, pleading with Bethany to see Craig for who he truly was, to see what Bethany herself was becoming by standing beside him. Now, they were choking on their own silence, and Eleanor was watching from above, literally. Her new apartment overlooked their courtyard, in a different building, on a higher floor, in a safer neighborhood, a view they could never afford. Eleanor didn't watch them constantly, just enough to remind herself that she wasn't crazy, that she hadn't imagined the betrayal, that what they had done to her had consequences. And yet, despite it all, some nights Eleanor still found herself sitting by the window, holding her phone, staring at Bethany's last unanswered text. "I really need you." The woman inside her, the mother, ached with a dull, persistent pain. But the woman she had become, the woman who had weathered the storm and found her own strength, knew that this was only the beginning. Eleanor had always thought heartbreak came in dramatic moments, slamming doors, shouted words, public scenes. But the real heartbreak, she was learning, was often silent, insidious, a slow erosion of hope and connection. It was the unanswered calls, the unreturned texts, the dawning realization that the people you had loved and trusted most could turn away with such chilling ease. And in that quiet understanding, a new kind of resolve began to solidify within Eleanor, a determination that would fuel her next, carefully considered moves. Eleanor had always thought heartbreak came in dramatic moments, slamming doors, shouted words, public scenes. But the real heartbreak, she was learning, was often silent, insidious, a slow erosion of hope and connection. It was the unanswered calls, the unreturned texts, the dawning realization that the people you had loved and trusted most could turn away with such chilling ease. And in that quiet understanding, a new kind of resolve began to solidify within Eleanor, a determination that would fuel her next, carefully considered moves. The letter read, "The building has officially been transferred. The final tenants have signed new agreements. The lawsuit against Mr. Harmon has been resolved in your favor. You are now free to sell, hold, or restructure as you see fit." Eleanor folded the letter carefully and held it to her chest. This wasn't just about money or property or revenge. This was about truth, about reclaiming her name, her story, her strength. The next morning, Eleanor called a realtor. She was ready to close the last chapter and open the door to a life she no longer had to survive. She could finally live it on her own terms. She sold the building in late spring. The final paperwork was signed on a bright, cloudless Tuesday. No fanfare, no ceremony, just a quiet click of a pen, a firm handshake, and the weight of 3 years of grief, betrayal, and silence finally lifting off her shoulders. The money was wired to her account the next day, but Eleanor didn't celebrate in any grand way. Instead, she wrote a check, a large one. Half of the proceeds went to a local shelter for women and children in crisis, the kind of place she wished she had known existed the night she stood on that curb with 2 suitcases and no one to call. She asked them to build a wing named after her mother, the Eleanor House. It was her way of honoring the woman who had given her strength in silence, who had hidden a lifetime of secrets so that Eleanor could one day discover the truth and become something more than what the world expected. The other half, Eleanor used to buy a small house. It wasn't extravagant, just a charming little two-bedroom on the same street where she had grown up in Willow Creek. Oak trees stood sentinel out front, a porch swing swayed gently in the breeze, and there was enough space for quiet reflection, for healing, and perhaps one day, for growing tomatoes if the fancy took her. The day Eleanor moved in, Bethany helped carry boxes. Neither of them said much, but after they finished unpacking, Bethany sat beside her on the porch swing, her legs tucked underneath her, her eyes scanning the familiar street as if she were trying to recognize the girl she used to be. "I remember riding my bike here," she said softly, "before everything got complicated." Eleanor nodded. "You were always safe here, Bethany." "I forgot how that felt," Bethany whispered. They didn't talk about Craig. They didn't need to. His chapter had closed without a dramatic ending, just a quiet disappearance into a new city, a new job, likely a new set of lies. But not before signing a non-disclosure agreement and quietly dropping his threats. The last thing he wanted was another legal battle, or worse, for the world to see the truth about him. He was a ghost now. Bethany stayed for dinner. They made grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, just like they used to when Bethany was little. Bethany laughed when she burned one side, and Eleanor laughed when Bethany tried to blame the pan. It was the first real laughter they had shared in years. That night, after Bethany left, Eleanor stood at the window, holding a cup of tea in both hands, watching the moonlight stretch across the front lawn. And for the first time in a long, long time, she said the words out loud, "I forgive you." Not just to Bethany, but to herself. Because that was the hardest part, not rising from the ashes, but learning that she was never the fire they had tried to extinguish. She was the spark they had underestimated. They had taught her that silence was weakness, but she had learned how to weaponize it. They had tried to erase her, and she had become someone they could never forget. Eleanor sat down on the comfortable sofa, opened her mother's diary one last time, and tucked a small note inside for Bethany to find someday. "You don't need their love to be worthy. You don't need their approval to be strong. You only need the truth, and to never, ever forget who you are." The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked softly in the background. Eleanor's tea grew cold in her hands, but her heart, finally, was warm. She hadn't needed to scream, she hadn't needed to win. She had simply needed to be who she was all along. And now, finally, Eleanor was home.